Imagine this. An African country blessed with natural resources begins to benefit from its resources. Or an African country no longer dependent on the West, focused on a path towards self-reliance and sustenance. Well, this is not just an imaginative story. It is real, and it is happening in Burkina Faso, thanks to the 35-year-old military leader, Ibrahim Traore. While the world has effectively dismissed this landlocked nation as unimportant, President Traoré has decided to change this narrative, establishing factories, reviving the country's economy, and changing the face of Burkina Faso. In today's video, we are going to show you some of the remarkable achievements made by Traoré since he came into power and how far Burkina Faso has come. When you talk about the top guns in Africa, Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt are the ones that are mentioned because of their large economy, population, and general status in the international community. No one talks about Burkina Faso except to mention that it is one of the poorest countries in the Sahel region, where there is no water, no electricity, and school children do not go to school. And they would have been correct. You see, Nigeria may have been called the giant of Africa for decades, but at one point in history before October 15, 1987, Burkina Faso would have certainly taken that position in Africa. And it's not because they had a large population like Nigeria. No, it's simply because of one man who dared to be different, Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary hero of Burkina Faso. This man came into power through a coup and stayed for just 4 years until he was assassinated by his closest friend Blaise Compaoré together with France. But in those 4 years, this man was able to transform Burkina Faso from a country scarred by the ravages of French colonialism and dependent on foreign aid to one that was self-sufficient at that time. He was at the forefront of women's liberation and paved the path for female entry into government positions. He initiated a nationwide illiteracy campaign, planted trees to curb desertification, and vaccinated millions of children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles. He built roads and a railway to tie the nation together, all without foreign aid, and encouraged Francophone Africa not to pay any colonial debt to France. He was set on making Burkina Faso a force to be reckoned with in Africa, but unfortunately, all his plans were cut short after he was assassinated and his so-called friend Blaise Compaoré took over the helm of power in Burkina Faso. The reversal of all the changes that occurred during Sankara's time was instantaneous. Compare who would go on to rule Burkina Faso for the next 27 years, set about undoing the progress achieved by the Sankara Revolution. Nationalized state entities were privatized, and Burkina Faso was redelivered into the clutches of the IMF, making the country go back to dependency on foreign powers, something that Sankara had successfully eliminated. What a shame. The annoying thing was, it wasn't just enough to kill Sankara and his works. The people behind it decided to defame his name, calling Sankara a messianic traitor. However, only a few people believed these allegations because Sankara's life was obvious for all to see. Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. Now, there is no doubt that if Sankara had not been killed, Burkina Faso would have grown to become the real giant of Africa. However, with the death of Sankara, Burkina Faso's glimpse of a bright future was cut, and the country descended into what it used to be described as one of the poorest countries in the Sahel, plagued by the resource curse. In fact, BBC once described the country as a poor country even by West African standards. Corruption, which Sankara had tried to eliminate, became the order of the day, and Compaoré went ahead to form tight bonds with the old colonial oppressor, France. France went on to have strongholds in the country, assuming a neo-colonial master status. Poverty, unemployment, bad infrastructures, and lack of basic social amenities such as good drinking water became the norm. The people were angry and frustrated. There was tension everywhere as the standard of living was very high. Throughout Compaoré's time as president, he didn't do anything despite all his promises. And so when Compaoré, who had ruled for 27 years, decided to change the constitution to allow him to rule for a 5th term in 2014, the people of Burkina Faso decided to stand up and say no. Hundreds of thousands of Burkinabés took to the streets to protest against his decision. As a result, Compaoré was forced to resign and abandon the luxurious trappings of the presidential palace, and flee for safety as his regime collapsed. He fled to Ivory Coast, where he remained in exile until 2022, when he stepped foot for the first time in Burkina Faso after being invited for a meeting with the interim president of Burkina Faso, President Paul-Henri Damiba. While still in Ivory Coast, he was sentenced in absentia in April 2021 for his involvement in the assassination of Thomas Sankara. After Compaoré fled the country in 2014, former Prime Minister and National Assembly President was elected his successor the following year. It was from this time that Burkina Faso began to suffer terrorist attacks by armed groups. By 2018, the attacks had intensified so much that a state of emergency was declared in several provinces at the end of the year. By this time, the description of Burkina Faso in the media had expanded to not just being one of the poorest countries in the Sahel region, but one that has insecurity problems. From 2019, the terrorist attacks became a daily affair. The only thing the government could do was constantly change the head of the armed forces or the defense chief. The killings and the inability of the government to do anything about it sparked protests and demonstrations across the country. So, in addition to dealing with insurgency, the government had to also deal with the growing civil unrest. Again, the narrative about Burkina Faso had changed from a country that was once stable to one plagued with political and civil instability. By January 2022, the people of Burkina Faso were tired of the government, and the military was also tired. So it came as no surprise that in January 2022, President Compaoré was ousted from power by Paul-Henri Damiba, a lieutenant colonel in the Burkinabe military. It also came as no surprise that the people of Burkina Faso were excited at the military takeover of the country. While the international community condemned the coup, thousands of Burkinabés took to the streets to express their support for the military government. They saw the coup as a sign that things were going to change. After Damiba was appointed as the interim president, he pledged to improve security and eventually restore civilian rule. The people were hopeful, but unfortunately, Damiba's regime failed to defeat the jihadists. Instead, the killings increased, the jihadists expanded their operations, and by September 2022, they controlled about 40% of Burkina Faso. This led to tensions in the military, with some believing that the reason why the jihadists were able to expand was because Damiba did not focus on the insurgency problem. And so, on September 30th, 2022, Damiba was ousted from power by a formidable force, Ibrahim Traore, with other junior officers. Unlike all the other leaders who had ruled Burkina Faso since the death of Thomas Sankara, Ibrahim Traore, with his actions and speech, proved that he is of a different breed. His actions and personality have made people compare him to Burkina Faso's hero, Thomas Sankara. Shockingly, both of them have a lot in common. At age 34, Traoré became the youngest president in the world after he was appointed as interim president of Burkina Faso, following the overthrow of Damiba's government. Unlike his predecessors, his rise to power has altered the course of Burkina Faso and set the country on a different path, a path to greatness. Observing his words, personality, and actions, people can't help but conclude that he is Thomas Sankara come to life. One of his early statements after he came into power was, "I know that I am younger than most of you here. We did not want what happened, but we did not have a choice." Traoré appeared to have faded to the background until July 2023, when he accompanied 16 other African heads of state to St. Petersburg in Russia for a meeting with President Vladimir Putin, who had organized the Russia-Africa Summit. It was during this two-day summit that Burkina Faso was catapulted into the spotlight as a country that has a formidable leader. And so the narrative about Burkina Faso changed. Yes, the country is still portrayed as poor and unstable due to the insecurity challenge, but the big difference is there is hope that Burkina Faso is going to get better because of Ibrahim Traore. In his speech at the Russia-African Summit, Traoré first highlighted the role of Africa and the Soviet Union in the fight against Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy during World War II. He bemoaned how historical narratives frequently marginalize these nations' crucial contributions, producing a false vision of history that ignores Africa's pivotal role. In an obvious call for a paradigm shift among African leadership, Traoré urged fellow African leaders to resist manipulation by imperialist forces. In his words, "We African heads of state have to stop behaving like puppets who dance every time the imperialists pull the strings." By the end of 2022, he continued, "My administration and I made calls for volunteers, leading to nearly 100,000 additional civilian forces enlisting. Several hundred of these courageous individuals have already sacrificed their lives to safeguard those of their fellow countrymen. What I cannot comprehend," Traoré said, "is why other African leaders who offer no assistance stoop so low as to label these brave men and women militias. Elsewhere, they would have been hailed as patriots." Traoré also emphasized the essential need of African nations' food self-sufficiency. He praised Russian President Vladimir Putin's promise that free food will be sent to 6 African nations following the collapse of the Black Sea Accord, while also portraying it as a wake-up call for African leaders. "At the next forum, we must not come here without having ensured food self-sufficiency for our peoples," he went on to say. In closing his speech, Traoré reiterated the powerful lines from Thomas Sankara's 1984 UN address: "The slave who is unable to assume his revolt does not deserve to be pitied," along with Sankara's distinctive finishing phrase, "Fatherland or death, we shall triumph." These words sounded like a battle cry, quickly spreading over social media channels and touching the hearts and spirits of African youths. This magnificent speech certainly gave a glimpse of the kind of leader Traoré is, and since then all his other addresses at summits and interviews have made him admirable all over Africa. But it's not just his words and statements, it's also his actions. Since he came to power, he has done more than his predecessors to fix the security problem as well as the development of Burkina Faso. Quite right, the jihadist crisis is still a big issue in the country 1 year after Traoré came to power. But within this 1 year, he has focused efforts on a strong security response to these attacks. From massive recruitment of volunteers for the defense of the homeland, general mobilization, purchase of drones and helicopters, equipping the military, neutralization of jihadists, and trips by President Traoré to the field to motivate troops. He has also signed new defense agreements with Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, all in a bid to deal with the security problem. Now, one of the remarkable projects that Traoré has launched in recent times was the revival of Air Burkina. Did you know that before Traoré came on the scene, the national Burkinabe airline, Air Burkina, depended on Western aircraft for its operation? Yes, even though the previous presidents had private jets, these people never thought that it was important for the country to own its own aircraft. Instead, they preferred to pay huge amounts of money and lease aircraft from the West. Tell me, how does that make sense? How can a national airline not own even a single aircraft? However, with Traoré in the scene, this pathetic situation in the Burkinabe aviation industry is about to change. For decades, Air Burkina struggled under the weight of Western financial traps by relying on leased aircraft from Western organizations to remain operational. The interesting thing is that leasing was painted as a pragmatic approach by the West, and the former government of Burkina Faso, including that of Blaise Compaoré, who had a private jet, accepted this approach. However, one thing you should understand is that the leasing agreements made between these Western organizations and African national airlines is the fact that the financial agreement bleeds the airlines dry over time. This agreement is the typical one-sided beneficial agreement that entails the majority of Western deals with African countries. And as you know, it allowed the West to maintain control and influence over African resources. However, Traoré's vision of an independent Burkinabe aviation industry has changed everything with the recent purchase of the Embraer 170, a revolutionary comeback for the Burkinabe airline. But how? Well, as a result of the leasing agreement, which has bled Air Burkina for decades, the airline has been suspended since April 2024. Can you imagine that? A national airline was suspended because of a shortage of funds. Now, prior to Traoré's investment in the sector, Air Burkina had 2 aircraft, a Boeing 737, 500 and a single Embraer 175, both of which were leased from the West but were not in operation as a result of a shortage of funds. However, the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, noted that the Traoré's administration realized that leasing aircraft for Air Burkina is not sustainable, and neither is it efficient. So the government decided to put resources together to purchase its own aircraft. And guess what? The Prime Minister revealed that the investment in Air Burkina was possible because of a silent partner who indicated interest in reviving the national airline. He further added that in July 2024, a potential financial backer, Investment Faso New, revealed the identity of the silent partner. Although that partner is unknown, it shows that Traoré's administration has the support of people who want to see the progress of the country, just like Traoré himself. This is a practical case of cooperation and commitment towards a goal and a vision. With this investment, Air Burkina has taken a new shape. Think about it. It is projected that African aviation is expected to grow by 9% annually. And right now, Burkina Faso has taken advantage of this to boost its aviation industry. However, Traoré's investment in Air Burkina is more than just revolutionizing the Burkinabe aviation industry. It actually sets a precedent for other African countries to follow, and by this, we mean that the narrative created by the West about how Africa's development is dependent on their financial aid is false. Just like how Thomas Sankara was able to achieve food self-sufficiency without any help from the West, President Traoré has started on a path to achieve full independence for the Burkinabe aviation industry without the help of the West. The simple fact is that Africa does not need foreign aid. In fact, one of the best things that can happen to the African continent is for Africans to wake up one morning and hear that no more foreign aid is coming into the continent either, because the African government finally decided to stop receiving aid, or Western countries decide not to give aid to Africa again. It may sound strange to some people given the fact that some African countries rely on foreign aid to complete their financial budget every year. But without mincing any words, the simple fact is that Africa does not need foreign aid. And that is because since Africa started receiving aid, the continent has not gotten better. Instead, the state of development is worse off than it just started. The rate of poverty across the continent has increased tremendously, with more than half of the population living below the poverty line. The standard of living has reduced, and per capita income for most African countries has reduced drastically or stagnant. So please then, what is the need for foreign aid in Africa? Finally, aid in Africa creates dependency. And it is one of the biggest reasons why Africa should stop receiving foreign aid, because it has made Africa dependent on the West. Since the inception of aid in Africa, it has become a major source of government funding. In 2009, foreign aid accounted for between 50% and 92% of overall government spending in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea-Bissau, Rwanda, Gambia, and Burundi, to name just a few. Imagine that every year, a budget is created in African countries, foreign aid is included as a source of revenue. Can you see why it's easy for the West to manipulate these countries to do their bidding? Because if they don't, the West can easily say we are stopping aid from being sent to your country unless you do what we say. It's what happened to Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali after the coup took place. This means aid has become a weapon, just like sanctions, to be used by the West to control Africa. The fact is, aid has done more harm than good to Africa. It has made Africa to be seen as a helpless continent that cannot do anything to help itself. But it's time to change this. Africa can do without foreign aid. The same way Traoré is doing away with dependence on the West, African countries should also strive to rely on themselves alone without any Western help. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel.